Welcome back to Chartwell Booksellers. We are open to all of you vaccinated people, and in lieu of visits today, we are going to create a new Chartwell Booksellers event around a very auspicious book on this very auspicious occasion. This is a first edition set of The River War. The River War was Winston Churchill's second published work. It came out in November 1899. 2003 sets only were printed in 1899. It is, as you see, a lavish two-volume tome, quite rare and valuable today. In condition like this is about as good as it gets. And this set we sell for $12,500. The River War documents Winston Churchill's brief time in Egypt in 1898 as a supernumerary lieutenant attached to the 21st Lancers, while also writing about the war in Egypt, in the Sudan, for the Morning Post at £15 per column. The British generals, especially the Sirdar, or commander of the Anglo-Egyptian army, one Herbert Kitchener, did not approve of the 23-year-old Churchill's journalistic presence on their battlefield. Churchill, for his part, did not particularly approve of the behavior of the generals on that battlefield, particularly Kitchener's conduct during and after the warfare that Churchill witnessed and participated in, including the last great cavalry charge in British military history at Omdurman. Churchill was not shy about expressing his disapproval explicitly in the River War, and this got him in a lot of trouble. As a result, when Churchill abridged the River War for a new 1902 one-volume edition, he removed just about all of his extremely cogent criticisms from it. Every single edition published since then has reprinted this abridgment. Unless you owned a first edition of The River War, you could not read The River War as Winston Churchill originally wrote it, until now. This is the reason we are here. This is a newly published, unabridged edition of The River War, restored and annotated by Professor James Muller, who has made this virtually his life's work. We owe Jim a great debt. The original unabridged River War is an intoxicatingly well-written attack on barbarism in war and a call for honoring one's enemies in victory. In other words, a lesson in Churchillian magnanimity. The River War Unabridged has just been published within the last few months, and we are celebrating it today by reading it to you aloud. To do a really fine job of this, we have Daniel Gerroll with us. Dan was born in London and has been for many years an honored actor on the West End, in the West End and on Broadway and off-Broadway. He has won the Theatre World Award for The Slab Boys and Knuckle, the Outer Critics Circle Award for Translation, and the Village Voices Obie Award for Sustained Excellence of Performance. His Broadway credits include Plenty, The Homecoming, and Enchanted April. You know him in the movies from Chariots of Fire, 84 Charing Cross Road, one of my favorites, Big Business, on television from Seinfeld, Cheers, Sex and the City, and Blacklist. And right here at Chartwell, Dan read from newly reissued editions of My African Journey and the story of the Malakand Field Force way back in 1989 with, of all people, Alec Baldwin. So I welcome Dan Gerroll back to Chartwell Booksellers and give you now The River War. Dan?
Thanks, Barry. It's an honor. The River War. All great movements, every vigorous impulse that a community may feel, become perverted and distorted as time passes, and the atmosphere of the earth seems fatal to the noble aspirations of its peoples. A wide humanitarian sympathy in a nation easily degenerates into hysteria. A military spirit tends towards brutality. Liberty leads to license, restraint, to tyranny. The pride of race is distended to blustering arrogance. The fear of God produces bigotry and superstition. There appears no exception to the mournful rule that the best efforts of men, however glorious their early results, have dismal endings. Like plants which shoot and bud and put forth beautiful flowers, and then grow rank and coarse and are withered by the winter. It is only when we reflect that the decay gives birth to fresh life, that new enthusiasms spring up to take the places of those that die. As the acorn is nourished by the dead leaves of the oak, the hope strengthens that the rise and fall of men and their movements are only the changing foliage of the ever-growing tree of life, while underneath a greater evolution goes on continually. It is not for me to say whether these pages contain anything of the slightest merit, but I assert with some pride that I have written, without fear or favour, only what I believe to be fair and true, and I venture to think that if the reader takes the trouble to follow the account on the maps which explain it, he will know as much about the River War as I have been able to learn in 12 months of diligent study. He who may be attracted by interest or driven by idleness to examine this book will find therein a tale of blood and war. The extremes of fortune are displayed, and he may read of the battles that were massacres, of others that were mere parades, of joyful victory or forlorn defeat, of exultation or of disappointment. In the story of the long and fierce contention he may remark occasions of shameful cowardice and reckless heroism, of plans conceived in haste and emergency, of schemes laid with slow deliberation, of wild extravagance and cruel waste, of economies more barbarous still, of wisdom and incompetence. He may observe men under many conditions, but mostly unfortunate, and applaud or condemn their behaviour. He may study a peculiar warfare fought under varied circumstances, the like of which have not been seen before, and if he should be persuaded to or compelled to follow the long road from initial tragedy to final triumph, he may admire the perseverance of a vigorous race who pursue their policies in spite of delay and disaster to victorious ends. Amid these regions and along the river was fought the war with which these pages are concerned. I do not exaggerate its importance. Even in the present day, it is only one among the various great enterprises of the state. In the near future, it will seem almost insignificant. The past in relation to the present is but a fleeting moment, nor is it to be expected that when others occupy the world, the events I have chronicled will attract their attention. Each generation exults in the immediate possession of life, and regards with indifference, scarcely tinged by pride or pity, the records and monuments of those that are no more. The greatest events of history are insignificant beside the bill of fare. The greatest men that ever lived serve to pass an idle hour. The tremendous crash of the Roman Empire is scarcely heard outside the schools and colleges. The past is insulted as much by what is remembered as by what is altogether forgotten. Yet, since the desire to live extends beyond the span of life, and men long for a refuge in memory, when the world shall have slipped from beneath their feet like a trapdoor, since we may credit ourselves with the sympathy posterity will continue to owe, and since some chroniclers, desiring in a distant age to write for his present a history of our past, may, rummaging among old books, find this. I have set forth in the expression of the times a true and impartial account of events which, though they will be forgotten in a century, nevertheless extended over 13 years of strife and involved the untimely destruction of 300,000 human lives. The case against Mr. Gladstone's administration is so black that historians will be more likely to exercise their talents in finding explanations and excuses than in urging the indictment. Something may be said of great difficulties something of good intentions, something of human fallibility, something of ill luck. But the real plea for oblivion is found in the fact that the conduct of affairs in Egypt by the radical government was in the spring of 1885 partly, and in the autumn of 1885 fully, supported by the electorate at general elections. A tremendous minority regarded their behavior with horror and contempt. A majority voted for them. Here is their best defense at the bar of history, and, since it can be sustained, that tribunal will be prevented from meeting its most scathing censures and will only be able to pronounce that the ministry were the representatives of the nation in an hour when its spirit was tame and sluggish, its courage and its fortunes low. These events produced a profound feeling of despondency in Great Britain. The shame associated with the Sudan made its name odious to the whole people. The heavy losses in men and money caused all projects for the recovery of the territory to be unpopular. The nation was prepared to accept its humiliation and acquiesce in its defeat. Yet in this dark hour there dawned a brighter day. While the whole country cowered, a new and vigorous spirit was growing in the great towns of England and Scotland, and in the freshening breeze of Tory democracy, pride in the past and hope for the future came back to the British people. In the passage of years, the Arabs might indeed have worked out their own salvation, as have the nations of Europe. The army, becoming effete, would wither and disappear, leaving behind it only the consciousness of nationality. A wise ruler might arise who should establish a more equitable and progressive polity. The natural course of development is long but true. The British people have selected a shorter, though more terrible road for the tribes to follow. Horatio, Herbert, Kitchener, the eldest son of a lieutenant colonel, was born in 1850. And after being privately educated, entered in 1869 the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich as a cadet of the Royal Engineers. He passed through the ordinary routine of a military training without attracting the attention of his comrades or instructors either by promise in study or prowess in athletics. In the spring of 1871 he obtained his commission, and for the first 10 years of his military service remained an obscure officer, performing his duties with regularity but giving no promise of the talents and character which he was afterwards to display. One powerful weapon, however, he acquired in this time of waiting. In 1874, accident or instinct led him to seek employment in the surveys that were being made of Cyprus and Palestine, and in the latter country he learned Arabic. For 6 years, the advantage of knowing a language with which few British officers were familiar brought him no profit. For procuring military preferment, Arabic was in 1874 as valueless as Patagonian. All this was swiftly changed by the surprising course of events. The year 1882 brought the British fleet to Alexandria, and the connection between England and Egypt began to be apparent. Kitchener did not neglect this opportunity. Securing leave of absence, he hurried to the scene of the crisis. The delays which preceded actual hostilities devoured his leave, though at his earnest request it was once extended. And while Arabi was still strengthening his fortifications, the time when Kitchener must return to the crushing routine of ordinary duty arrived. But the political climax was also approaching. The British residents in Alexandria were advised to embark in refuge ships. On a steamer in the harbour, the future Martinet meditated disobedience of orders. Should he break his leave or not? As a last chance, he applied for a further extension. He felt that it would be refused, and it was at the suggestion of a newspaper correspondent that he added that he would assume it granted unless he was recalled by telegraph. The telegram came with promptness, but it fell into the hands of the friendly newspaper correspondent, who did not manage to deliver it until the weekly Cyprus mail had left, and compliance with his orders was for the time being impossible. Thus a week was gained. Much might happen before the week was out. The event was fortunate. 4 days later, Alexandria was bombarded. Detachments from the fleet were landed to restore order. The British government decided to send an army to Egypt. British officers and soldiers were badly wanted at the seat of the war. An officer who could speak Arabic was indispensable. Thus Kitchener came to Egypt and set his feet firmly on the high road to fortune. It is strange that the soldier who is at this moment the bitterest opponent of the press that modern militarism has yet produced in England should have received such material assistance at the turning point of his life from a special correspondent, and that the general who, in the interests of regularity, has opposed, always uncompromisingly, though sometimes unsuccessfully, this enterprising subaltern, should have based his success upon an act of pardonable indiscipline. But it is his work, and not his character, that now claims our attention. He came to Egypt when she was plunged in misery and shame, when hopeless ruin seemed already the only outcome of the public disasters, and when even greater misfortunes impended. He remained to see her prosperous and powerful, to restore empire to her people, peace to her empire, honour to her army, and among those clear-minded men of action by whom the marvellous work of regeneration has been accomplished, Herbert Kitchener will occupy certainly the third and possibly even the second place. For the next 4 years, he worked busily in the War Office at Cairo, effecting many useful reforms and hard economies, and revealing strange powers of organization which, although not yet appreciated by his comrades in the Egyptian service, were noticed by one vigilant eye. In 1892, Sir F. Grenfell resigned the post of Sirdar, and the chief command of the Egyptian army was vacant. 2 men stood out prominently as candidates: Colonel Woodhouse, who held the command of the Halfa Field Force, and the Adjutant General. Colonel Woodhouse had undoubtedly the greater claims. He had been for several years in command of a large force in continual contact with the enemy. He had won the action of Argin, and was known throughout the Sudan as the conqueror of Wad el-Nejumi. He had conducted the civil administration of the frontier province with conspicuous success, and he was popular with all ranks of the Egyptian army. Kitchener had little to set against this. He had shown himself a brave and active soldier. He was known to be a good official, but he had been a failure in civil administration, and was moreover little known to and less liked by his brother officers. Sir Evelyn Baring's influence, however, turned the scale. To the astonishment, indeed to the disgust, of the Egyptian army, Kitchener was promoted Sirdar. Lord Cromer had found the military officer whom he considered capable of reconquering the Sudan when the opportunity should come. Shortly before midnight, on the 12th of March, 1896, the Sirdar received instructions from Lord Cromer authorizing an expedition into the Dongola province and directing him to occupy Akasha. The next morning the news was published in the Times, ostensibly as coming from its correspondent in Cairo. The Egyptian cabinet was convened to give a formal assent by voting the decree. On the 14th, the reserves were called out. On the 15th, the Khedive reviewed the Cairo garrison, and at the termination of the parade, Sir H. Kitchener informed him that the earliest battalions would start for the front that night. The Egyptian frontier force had always been kept in a condition of immediate readiness by the restless activity of the enemy. The beginning of the long-expected advance was hailed with delight by the British officers sweltering at Wadi Halfa and Saras. On Sunday, the 15th of March, 3 days after the Sirdar had received his orders, and before his reinforcements had started from Cairo, Colonel Hunter, who commanded on the frontier, formed a small column of all arms to seize and hold Akasha. At dawn on the 18th, the column started, and the actual invasion of the territory, which for 10 years had been abandoned to the dervishes, began. The route lay through a wild and rocky country, the debatable ground, desolated by years of war, and the troops straggled into a long procession and had several times for more than an hour to move in single file over passes and through narrow defiles strewn with the innumerable boulders from which the belly of stones had derived its name. The right of their line of march was protected by the Nile, and although it was occasionally necessary to leave the bank to avoid difficult ground, the column camped each night by the river. The cavalry and the camel corps searched the country to the south and east, for it was expected that the dervishes would resist the advance. Creeping along the bank, and prepared at a moment's notice to stand at bay at the water's edge, the small force proceeded on its way. Wadi Atira was reached on the 18th, Tanjore on the 19th, and on the 20th the column marched into Akasha. The business of the general is to defeat the enemy. Nevertheless, when all has been fairly stated, it is evident that if more attention had been paid to the subject, arrangements might have been made which would have increased the popularity of the commander and diminished the sufferings of the troops. Such is the melancholy end of brave men who fall in war. The living divide the triumph. The dead, without whom, perchance, it would hardly have been won, have but a dull occupation. Yet theirs is no worse than the common fate of man, for I suppose when we are ourselves overtaken by death, the surroundings of home and friends will not make much appreciable difference. To struggle and choke in the hushed and darkened room of a London house, while without the great metropolis is planning and contriving, while the special editions report the progress of the latest European crisis, and all the world is full of the business of the morrow, will not seem less unsatisfactory than when thrilled with fierce and yet generous emotions to die in the sunshine and be spaded under before the night. The Battle of Alderman, September the 2nd, 1898. The bugles all over the camp by the river began to sound at 4:30. The cavalry trumpets and the drums and fifes of the British division joined the chorus, and everyone awoke amid a confusion of merry or defiant notes. Then it grew gradually lighter, and the cavalry mounted their horses, the infantry stood to their arms, and the gunners went to their batteries, while the sun, rising over the Nile, revealed the wide plain, the dark rocky hills, and the waiting army. It was as if all the preliminaries were settled, the ground cleared, and nothing remained but the final act and the rigor of the game. Even before it became light, several squadrons of British and Egyptian cavalry were pushed swiftly forward to gain contact with the enemy and learn his intentions. The first of these, under Captain Baring, occupied Surgham Hill, and waited in the gloom until the whereabouts of the dervishes could be disclosed by the dawn. It was a perilous undertaking, for he might have found them unexpectedly near. As the sun rose, the 21st Lancers trotted out of the zeriba and threw out a spray of officers' patrols. As there had been no night attack, it was expected that the dervish army would have retired to their original position or entered the town. It was hardly conceivable that they would advance across the open ground to attack the zeriba by daylight. Indeed, it appeared more probable that their hearts had failed them in the night and that they had melted away into the desert. But these anticipations were immediately dispelled by the scene which was visible from the crest of the ridge. It was 6:15. The light was dim, but growing stronger every minute. There in the plain lay the enemy, their numbers unaltered, their confidence and intentions apparently unshaken. Their front was now nearly 5 miles long, and composed of great masses of men joined together by thinner lines. Behind and near to the flanks were large reserves. From the ridge they looked dark blurs and streaks, relieved and diversified with an odd-looking shimmer of light from their spear points. At about 10 minutes to 6 it was evident that the masses were in motion and advancing swiftly. Their emirs galloped about and before the ranks. Scouts and patrols scattered themselves all over the front. Then they began to cheer. They were still a mile away from the hill, and were concealed from the Sardar's army by the folds of the ground. The noise of the shouting was heard, albeit faintly, by the troops down by the river. But to those watching on the hill, a tremendous roar came up in waves of intense sound, like the tumult of the rising wind and sea before a storm. Although the dervishes were steadily advancing, a belief that their musketry was indeed inferior encouraged a nearer view, and we trotted round the southwest slopes of Surgham Hill until we reached the sandhills on the enemy's side, among which the regiment had waited the day before. Thence the whole array was visible in minute detail. It seemed that every single man of all the thousands could be examined separately. The pace of their march was fast and steady, and it was evident that it would not be safe to wait among those sandhills. Yet the wonder of the scene exercised a dangerous fascination, and for a while we tarried. The emblems of the more famous emirs were easily distinguishable. On the extreme left, the chiefs and soldiers of the bright green flag gathered under Ali Wed Helu. Between this and the centre, the large dark green flag of Osman Sheikh ed-Din rose above a dense mass of spearmen, preceded by long lines of warriors armed presumably with rifles. Over the centre, commanded by Yaqub, the sacred black banner of the Khalifa floated high and remarkable, while on the right a great square of dervishes was arrayed under an extraordinary number of white flags, amid which the red ensign of Sharif was almost hidden. All the pride and might of the dervish empire was massed on this last great day of its existence. Riflemen who had helped to destroy Hicks, spearmen who had charged at Abu Klea, emirs who saw the sack of Gondar, Begara fresh from raiding the Shaluks, warriors who had besieged Khartoum, all marched, inspired by the memories of former triumphs, and embittered by the knowledge of late defeats, to chastise the impudent and accursed invaders. The advance continued. The dervish left began to stretch out across the plain towards Kareri. As I thought, to turn our right flank. Their centre, under the black flag, moved directly towards Surgham. The right pursued a line of advance south of that hill. This mass of men was most striking of all. They could not have mustered fewer than 6,000. Their array was perfect. They displayed a great number of flags, perhaps 500, which looked at the distance white, though they were really covered with texts from the Koran, and which by their admirable alignment made this division of the Khalifa's army look like an old representation of the Crusaders in the Bayeux tapestry. The attack developed. The left, nearly 20,000 strong, toiled across the plain and approached the Egyptian squadrons. The leading masses of the centre deployed facing the Zariba and marched forthwith to the direct assault. As the whole dervish army continued to advance, the division with the white flags, which had until now been echeloned in rear of their right, moved up into the general line and began to climb the southern slopes of Surgham Hill. Meanwhile, yet another body of the enemy, comparatively insignificant in numbers, who had been drawn up behind the white flags, were moving slowly towards the Nile, echeloned still further behind their right and not far from the suburbs of Omdurman. These men had evidently been posted to prevent the dervish army being cut off from the city and to secure their line of retreat. And with them the 21st Lancers were destined to have a much closer acquaintance. In the distance, the enemy could be seen re-entering Omdurman in hundreds. There was no room for doubt they must be stopped, and incidentally these small parties in the plain might be brushed away. We remounted. The ground looked smooth and unbroken, yet it was desirable to reconnoitre. 2 patrols were sent out. The small party of dervishes, who were scattered all over the plain and the slopes of the hill, prevented anything less than a squadron moving except at their peril. The first patrol struck out towards Omdurman and began to push in between the scattered dervishes, who fired their rifles and showed great excitement. The other patrol under Lieutenant Grenfell was sent to see what the ground looked like from further along the ridge and on the lower slopes of Surgham. The riflemen among the rocks turned their fire from the regiment to these nearer objects. The 5 brown figures cantered over the rough ground, presenting difficult targets, but under continual fire, and disappeared round the spur. However, in 2 or 3 minutes they reappeared, the riflemen on the hill making a regular rattle of musketry, amid which the lancers galloped safely back, followed last of all by their officer. He said that the plain looked as safe from the other side of the hill as from where we were. At this moment the other patrol returned. They too had had good fortune in their adventurous ride. Their information was exact. They reported that in a shallow and apparently practicable khor, about 3/4 of a mile to the southwest and between the regiment and the fugitives, there was drawn up a formed body of dervishes about 1,000 strong. Colonel Martin decided on this information to advance and attack this force, which alone interposed between him and the Arab line of retreat. Then we started. The 21st Lancers left the ridge. We advanced at a walk in mass for about 300 yards. The scattered parties of dervishes fell back and melted away, and only one straggling line of men in dark blue waited motionless 1/4 of a mile to the left front. They were scarcely 100 strong. The regiment continued into line of squadron columns, and continued at a walk until within 300 yards of this small body of dervishes. The firing behind the ridges had stopped. There was complete silence, intensified by the recent tumult. Far beyond the thin blue row of dervishes, the fugitives were visible, streaming into Omdurman. And should these few devoted men impede a regiment? Yet it were wiser to examine their position from the other flank before slipping a squadron at them. The heads of the squadrons wheeled slowly to the left, and the lancers, breaking into a trot, began to cross the dervish front in column of troops. Thereupon, and with one accord, the blue-clad men dropped on their knees, and there burst out a loud, crackling fire of musketry. It was hardly possible to miss such a target at such a range. Horses and men fell at once. The only course was plain and welcome to all. The colonel, nearer than his regiment, already saw what lay behind the skirmishers. He ordered right wheel into line to be sounded. The trumpet jerked out a shrill note, heard faintly above the trampling of the horses and the noise of the rifles. On the instant all the 16 troops swung round and locked up into a long galloping line, and the 21st Lancers were committed to their first charge in war. 250 yards away, the dark blue men were firing madly in a thin film of light blue smoke. Their bullets struck the hard gravel into the air, and the troopers, to shield their faces from the stinging dust, bowed their helmets forward like the cuirassiers at Waterloo. The pace was fast and the distance short, yet the fort was half covered. The whole aspect of the affair changed. A deep crease in the ground, a dry watercourse, a khor, appeared where all had seemed smooth, level plain, and from it there sprang, with the suddenness of a pantomime effect, and a high-pitched yell. A dense white mass of men, nearly as long as our front and about 12 deep. A score of horsemen and a dozen bright flags rose as if by magic from the earth. Eager warriors sprang forward to anticipate the shock. The rest stood firm to meet it. The lancers acknowledged the apparition only by an increase of pace. Each man wanted sufficient momentum to drive through such a solid line. The flank troops, seeing that they overlapped, curved inwards like the horns of a moon, but the whole event was a matter of seconds. The riflemen, firing bravely to the last, were swept head over heels into the corps, and jumping down with them at full gallop and in the closest order, the British squadrons struck the fierce brigade with one loud, furious shout. The collision was prodigious. Nearly 30 lancers, men and horses, and at least 200 Arabs were overthrown. The shock was stunning to both sides, and for perhaps 10 wonderful seconds no man heeded his enemy. Terrified horses wedged in the crowd, bruised and shaken men sprawling in heaps, struggled, dazed and stupid, to their feet, panted and looked about them. Several fallen lancers had even time to remount. Meanwhile, the impetus of the cavalry carried them on, as a rider tears through a bullfinch. The officers forced their way through the press, and as an iron rake might be drawn through a heap of shingle, so the regiment followed. They shattered the dervish array, and their pace reduced to a walk, scrambled out of the corps on the further side, leaving a score of troopers behind them, and dragging on with the charge more than 1,000 Arabs. Then, and not till then, the killing began. And thereafter each man saw the world along his lance, under his guard, or through the backsight of his pistol, and each had his own strange tale to tell. Stubborn and unshaken infantry hardly ever meet stubborn and unshaken cavalry. Either the infantry run away or are cut down in flight, or they keep their heads and destroy nearly all the horsemen by their musketry. On this occasion, 2 living walls had actually crashed together. The dervishes fought manfully. They tried to hamstring the horses. They fired their rifles, pressing the muzzles into the very bodies of their opponents. They cut reins and stirrup leathers. They flung their throwing spears with great dexterity. They tried every device of cool, determined men practiced in war and familiar with cavalry. And besides, they swung sharp, heavy swords which bit deep. The hand-to-hand fighting on the further side of the corps lasted for perhaps 1 minute. Then the horses got into their stride again, the pace increased, and the lancers drew out from among the antagonists. Within 2 minutes of the collision, every living man was clear of the dervish mass. All who had fallen were cut at with swords till they stopped quivering. But no artistic mutilations were attempted. The enemy's behavior gave small ground for complaint. 200 yards away the regiment halted, rallied, faced about, and in less than 5 minutes were reformed and ready for a second charge. The men were anxious to cut their way back through their enemies. We were alone together, the cavalry regiment and the dervish brigade. The ridge hung like a curtain between us and the enemy. The general battle was forgotten as it was unseen. This was a private quarrel. The other might have been a massacre, but here the fight was fair, for we fought with sword and spear. Indeed, the advantage of ground and numbers lay with them, all prepared to settle the debate at once and forever. But some realization of the cost of our wild ride began to come to those who were responsible. Riderless horses galloped across the plain. Men clinging to their saddles lurched helplessly about, covered with blood from perhaps a dozen wounds. Horses streaming from tremendous gashes limped and staggered with their riders. In 120 seconds, 5 officers, 65 men, and 119 horses out of less than 400 had been killed or wounded. The dervish line, broken by the charge, began to reform at once. They closed up, shook themselves together, and prepared with constancy and courage for another shock. But on military considerations, it was desirable to turn them out of the corps first, and thus deprive them of their vantage ground. The regiment again drawn up, 3 squadrons in line and the 4th in column, now wheeled to the right, and galloping round the dervish flank, dismounted and opened a heavy fire with their magazine carbines. Under the pressure of this fire, the enemy changed front to meet the new attack, so that both sides were formed at right angles to their original lines. When the dervish change front was completed, they began to advance against the dismounted men. But the fire was accurate, and there can be little doubt that the moral effect of the charge had been very great, and that this brave enemy was no longer unshaken. Be this as it may, the fact remains that they retreated swiftly, though in good order, towards the ridge of Surgham Hill, where the Khalifa's black flag still waved, and the 21st Lancers remained in possession of the round and of their dead. Such is the true and literal account of the charge. The valour of their deed has been discounted by those who have told the tale. Mad fanaticism is the depreciating comment of their conquerors. I hold this to be a cruel injustice, nor can he be a very brave man who will not credit them with a nobler motive and believe that they died to clear their honour from the stain of defeat. Why should we regard as madness in the savage what would be sublime in civilized men? For I hope that if evil days should come upon our own country, and the last army which a collapsing empire could interpose between London and the invader were dissolving in rout and ruin, that there would be some, even in these modern days, who would not care to accustom themselves to a new order of things and tamely survive the disaster. By Sir H. Kitchener's orders, the tomb of the Mahdi, the dervish's spiritual chieftain, had been profaned and razed to the ground. The corpse of the Mahdi was dug up. The head was separated from the body, and, to quote the official explanation, preserved for future disposal, a phrase which must in this case be understood to mean that it was passed from hand to hand until it reached Cairo. Here it remained, an interesting trophy, until the affair came to the ears of Lord Cromer, who ordered it to be immediately reinterred at Wadi Halfa. The limbs and trunk were flung into the Nile. Such was the chivalry of the conquerors. I have tried to gild war, and to solace myself for the loss of dear and gallant friends, with the thought that a soldier's death for a cause that he believes in will count for much, whatever may be beyond this world. When the soldier of a civilized power is killed in action, his limbs are composed, and his body is borne by friendly arms reverently to the grave. The wail of the fifes, the roll of the drums, the triumphant words of the funeral service, all divest the act of its squalor, and the spectator sympathizes with, perhaps almost envies, the comrade who has found this honorable exit. But there was nothing dulce et decorum about the dervish dead, nothing of the dignity of unconquerable manhood. All was filthy corruption. Yet these were as brave men as ever walked the earth. The conviction was borne in on me that their claim beyond the grave in respect of a valiant death was not less good than that which any of our countrymen could make. The thought may not be original. It may happily be untrue. It seemed certainly most unwelcome There they lie, those valiant warriors of a false faith and fallen domination, their only history preserved by their conquerors, their only monument their bones, and these the drifting sand of the desert will bury in a few short years. 3 days before I had seen them rise, eager, confident, resolved. The roar of their shouting had swelled like the surf on a rocky shore. The flashing of their blades displayed their numbers, their vitality, their ferocity. They were confident in their strength, in the justice of their cause, in the support of their religion. Now only the heaps of corruption in the plain and the fugitives dispersed and scattered in the wilderness remained. The terrible machinery of scientific war had done its work. The dervish host was scattered and destroyed. Their end, however, only anticipates that of the victors, for time, which laughs at science, as science laughs at valor, will, in due course, contemptuously brush both combatants away. We are told that the Anglo-Egyptian army invaded the Sudan to punish the wickedness of its inhabitants. It is the habit of the boa constrictor to besmear the body of his victim with a foul slime before he devours it, and there are many people in England, and perhaps elsewhere, who seem to be unable to contemplate military operations for clear political objects, unless they can cajole themselves into the belief that their enemy are utterly and hopelessly vile. To this end, the dervishes from the Mahdi and the Khalifa downwards have been loaded with every variety of abuse and charged with all conceivable crimes. This may be very comforting to philanthropic persons at home, but when an army in the field becomes imbued with the idea that the enemy are vermin who cumber the earth, instances of barbarity may very easily be the outcome. To persevere and trust Krober is the watchword of the Englishman in Egypt. Few men are indispensable, yet it is accepted as axiomatic that everything depends upon the great administrator. With time, that first essential of all Egyptian politics, and a free hand, Cromer will, if his life be spared, overcome the difficulties and crises of the next 6 years, as he has surmounted those of the past 15. Then the worst will be over. The lean years will be followed by the fat. The Sudan will cost less and less. The reservoirs will pay more and more. And Egypt, invigorated and triumphant, will step forward on the path of progress and prosperity, leading by the hand the provinces reconquered in the River War.
I'm speaking now with the man responsible for the restoration of what we just heard, Professor James Muller, who is the hero of this story. And I'm very delighted to have you with us, Jim, so we can ask you a few questions and learn more about how this all took place. Jim, to begin with, how much of what we read today was cut material from the first edition?
Almost everything. Almost everything that your listeners just heard wasn't in the abridged edition. That's been the only one that's been in print for 120 years. The only exceptions were the discussion of Herbert Kitchener, which was left in, but which was sanitized and changed quite a bit. What they heard was the original version of that. But there is a version, a shortened version in the abridged edition. And then the other bit that was in the original edition and kept in the abridgment that they heard was about the cavalry charge at Omdurman, right, though that was considerably shortened in the abridged version as well.
Was the Omdurman charge material that was cut for any, again, sort of any editorial reason, something beyond editorial reasons? Was there anything sensitive in there?
Well, Yes, I mean, there are several chapters on the Battle of Omdurman in the first edition of the book. And several of those are completely cut out without a trace in the abridged version. And many of those chapters, several of those chapters have very sensitive things. Churchill's criticisms of bombarding the tomb, some of his criticisms of Kitchener's strategy in the battle, and especially also his criticisms of Kitchener's treatment of the wounded on both sides. Those are all either cut out or very much softened in the shortened version of the book.
What kind of flack did Churchill receive from Kitchener and the generals after the publication that caused him to make the cuts?
One question that's implicit in the way you've asked the last two questions is hoping that we have some hard evidence for how these cuts were made and why Churchill made them. And that's a very interesting question because really, after more than 30 years of looking into this, there is not much direct evidence that I've been able to find. What I have been able to find in a very comprehensive way is exactly what the changes were. And the new edition shows that to the reader in a variety of ways. First of all, by printing in red instead of in black everything that was cut out of the first edition when it was abridged, but then also in footnotes by showing what was changed, because Churchill changed things as well as cutting them out. Now, in some cases, we can be pretty sure just from seeing what happened why Churchill made changes. For instance, there were a number of people who read the book after it came out who had been present in the whole campaign from 1896 to 1899, which Churchill wasn't. He was there only for about 3 weeks. And so he had to borrow information from people who were there, which he did in a very thorough way, even though Kitchener tried to prevent his important subordinates from giving Churchill any written information. Churchill interviewed them orally, and most of them were pretty willing to talk to him and told him what he needed to know. So in some cases, we know that later people wrote to Churchill and told him that in fact there had been fewer casualties at a certain small skirmish than he had in the book, or that he had gotten some fact wrong. In other cases, people who reviewed the book had, with varying degrees of sympathy or asperity, criticized Churchill and corrected him. And so in a number of those cases, Churchill either cut out the passage in question or made changes according to corrections he had been given. So in those cases, we kind of know that it was because he either on better information changed his mind and wanted to correct it, or for one reason or another, he thought it was controversial and he'd best leave it out. But what I've not been able to find anywhere is are marked up copies showing the cuts that were going to be made. There are just a few cases of that one can find, but most of those are relatively trivial. And what I think that means is one of two or three things. The first thing, which is pretty likely, is that Churchill was somewhat less systematic when he was such a young man, doing all his work himself, and had fewer people to help him with filing and administrative chores than he did have fairly soon afterward. He was still writing the book in pen, for instance. He wasn't having it typed. He wasn't dictating it. And he didn't have typing ability himself. So there's that possible reason. Another possible reason is that Churchill was staying at a house which had a big fire, and a number of his papers were not rescued from the fire. So that's a possibility. But I think the most likely possibility is that all those papers that would have shown more went to the publisher, and the Luftwaffe scored a direct hit on the headquarters of the publisher of the book, Longmans, during the Blitz.
Did he ever express a desire that you're aware of in the course of his lifetime to have that original first edition reissued?
Not that I know of. And one of the puzzles is that when the collected works edition were put together after he died, there doesn't seem to have been any effort on the part of the editor, Frederick Woods, to restore the longer version of the book. But quite honestly, it would have been a very big editorial job.
We talked about detective work. Is there anything that you want to share with us from your Sherlock Holmes perspective on this book?
Well, you know, it's good and bad that it has taken me so very long to get this job done. There are some real advantages to having waited longer than I had originally hoped the job would take. And that is what's happened in between my resolving on this project and getting it done is, first of all, the 100th anniversary of the battle. And there were several books that came out at that time, which tipped me off to things I didn't know. And among those that were most important were the discovery in the archives of the newspaper for which Churchill had written the dispatches, of his original dispatches. One of the most important features of this new edition is actually not the text of the book at all, but a very long, sort of more than 100-page long appendix that I've added, Appendix 1 in the back, after Churchill's 5 appendices, only 2 of which survived in the abridged version. And that first appendix gives the text of Churchill's dispatches as he wrote them originally, taken from the 14 of the 15 dispatches that survived. One of them is gone, alas, which are in the archives at Leeds. And I discovered that those were there because of one of these books that came out in 1998. But I happened to be in Britain at the time, and I went right up to Leeds, and I spent several days transcribing those from Churchill's handwriting. We compared those carefully to the newspaper versions, which we got at the old British Library newspaper archive, which is now all digitized, but wasn't then. And that way we were able to see what changes the editors had made.
When did you start this, Jim, and what prompted you? Was this the first that you tackled and then moved on to Great Contemporaries and Thoughts and Adventures? I think so, right?
I was working on Churchill, and I just finished writing a chapter for a book on Churchill's writings about the River War, using the abridged version of the book. And then I was working away on South Africa after that, in the winter of 88, 89. And at some point in January, I looked back at the catalog of the British Library on the holdings for the River War. And the catalog was so old, it wasn't even a card catalog. It was a catalog, in many cases, handwritten in a book. And as I looked at the listings for the River War, I saw one that said 2 volumes. And I thought, what's that? And so I ordered the book, and as it turned out, it was a rare book, and it had to be delivered to me in a different reading room where they had stricter rules. And that was when I discovered there was this much longer version of the book. And I kept it for several days going through the whole thing because I knew the book very well, or I thought I did, from the abridged version. But then I began finding passage after passage that I didn't remember and that wasn't in the abridged version of the book. And that's when I discovered there were 7 whole chapters left out. And gradually I realized, as I did a real study of it, and with students to help me reading it out loud so we could compare the text, that there were parts left out of every single chapter, and quite significant parts. And so that was in 1989. And fairly soon after that, I thought, gosh, we really should have an edition that brings back the original text, but also shows the changes that were made, which are all very interesting, and has the additional material Churchill added in the abridged version to bring the story to a conclusion. And so that was the beginning of the book.
How do you feel about the River War at this very moment, having finally completed this journey?
Well, it's a very strange thing to have the book now bound and on my shelf to keep me company instead of the project. Although, I'm headed over to England next week for the book launch over there. It's been a terribly slow rollout for the book because of COVID and because of all the supply chain problems. The book is a very multinational project in that, aside from the various countries I've mentioned where research had to be done, so the book was typeset, now get this, starting in 2006. Oh. And thousands and thousands of changes, corrections, and additions were made for more than 15 years to try to get this book in perfect shape. And I'm extremely obliged to the very careful workers in India who did that work, and to my publisher, St. Augustine's Press, for being so patient and being willing to pay for all those typographical changes. But I didn't want to do the job and have it done less than just the way it should be done. I think the publisher is close to finding another printer, but I don't know that the third printing will be available until, quite a few months from now, unfortunately.
And all I can say is that it was worth the wait. So, on that score, congratulations. It's a beautiful book. They're beautiful books.
Thank you. Yes, we're really very happy with the way it turned out. And I do want to say that I have been very grateful to readers who have gotten in touch with me. Sometimes people think there's a mistake and there really isn't. But if you watching this read the book and find something which puzzles you and which you think might be in error, please do let me know. I won't take umbrage. I'll congratulate you on finding it, and I'll be grateful to you. The goal, was to put this book back the way Churchill originally meant it to be, but also to show something about the history of it. I'm just sorry, honestly, that there are so many people who have cheered this project on, encouraged me to do it, who are not any longer here to see the result. But those who are, I do hope you enjoy reading it. It's a wonderful read.
Well, Jim, I just want to thank you. I want to say, exhale. Congratulations. It's done. It's a marvelous achievement. We're very grateful to you for it. I think the next thing now, like Martin Gilbert had to write In Search of Churchill, the book about writing the official biography, the next book for you will be In Search of the River War, because all of these stories are quite extraordinary.
Well, some of them are told in a little essay at the very beginning of the first volume called The Making of This Book.
Yes, I did.
So I think, readers either before or after they've read the Churchill's writing could look there for some of them. But no, the next project I've got to get done is the annotated edition of Churchill's autobiography, My Early Life. But we just have to work out the contractual and copyright issues, and then I hope we can get that into print maybe next year.
Marvelous. Well, we'll sell it well.
I hope your shelves are soon cleared off of your stock, and then we'll hope that it's not too long before the third printing.
I wish that for the both of us. Yes. Thank you again, Jim, and have a safe trip to England.